I played every Dragon Ball fighting game. Part 2. This is, of course, the second part in a series where I play every Dragon Ball fighting game. To be clear, this video does assume that you've seen the first part, which should pop up right at the top of your screen here. Before we get into it, I just want to give a huge shout out to my patrons, including Melancholis in the Omega Gamer tier, and that's just Ash and Solo the Meg Cup Experience in the Played Every Game tier. And on top of that, everyone you see on your screen here. Your support means a lot to me, even when all of the polls on my Patreon are evenly split. Alright, let's get right back into the games. Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Battle 22 was released for the PlayStation in 1995 in Japan, 1996 in Europe, and all the way in 2003 in America. Right off the bat, this game has a really nice, fully animated intro. I can't tell if the footage was pulled directly from the show or made just for this game, but I'd probably lean more toward the side of this being made especially for this game, given that all of the character artwork in this game also seems to have been created by actual animators for Dragon Ball. While the animation isn't mind-blowing quality and is kind of choppy at best, I do admire the effort that had to have gone into making this kind of animation style work in a video game. I honestly can't really drag that down too much. It's a really unique idea. The only thing that I will criticize is this weird perspective shift thing that they try to do to show airborne characters. When a character flies into the air, their sprite just kind of grows, I guess? It looks really odd and out of place, and it doesn't at all give any illusion of depth. The biggest mistake this game makes, though, is that they chose to put this really decent 2D artwork against the most bland and boring 3D backgrounds possible. I know this is on the PlayStation, and I know it doesn't have all the fancy rendering capabilities of modern machines, but really it just feels like all of the budget in this game was blown on the animation. These backgrounds just aren't great, even by PlayStation standards. The only one that makes sense to be kind of bland is the Cell Games Arena, but in my opinion, that should be the outlier, probably not the norm. I'm sure the PlayStation could handle better backgrounds, and honestly, they really should have just stuck with 2D backgrounds. I won't linger on that too long though, because we'll actually see an example of the backgrounds done properly very soon. The presentation itself is fine, and the actual animations, again, look pretty good, and there's a bunch of character voices during fights. Barring that though, it really is dragged down by these just not so great backgrounds. Speaking of not so great, let's talk about the gameplay. This game's entire playing field is 3D, but it's still a 2D fighter. That's not really an issue though. The issue is the insane cooldown time on every attack. While I understand that there needs to be recovery frames for attack animations, this game's recovery is so excessive it makes the fights feel incredibly slow. On top of that, you can charge up ki by holding down an attack button for a couple of seconds, which feels really unresponsive, especially when you're trying to avoid getting hit with opponents' ki blasts. And to elaborate on ki blasts, the ultimate moves like Kamehameha aren't really translated well here. It and other special wave moves just look like slightly larger standard ki blasts, which is kind of a shame because the actual character animations, again, are pretty decent. Now let me tell you something that this game does right. While it does seem possible to unlock secret characters through the build-up mode, you can also use a cheat code to unlock 5 additional characters in this game. Not only does the title screen update to Ultimate Battle 27 to reflect the new number of playable characters, but you even get a cool intro sequence styled cinematic video showing off the unlockable characters. I wasn't expecting this at all, and it's really cool that they went out of their way to animate this. Another thing this game does right, well, kind of right, is its cut content. Yeah, if you only played the American release of this game, there's an entire piece of content that you never got to see. Before every fight, there was a voiced mini cutscene between both selected characters using completely unique artwork that you don't seem to see anywhere else. This is entirely missing in the American release for some reason. While I originally thought it might be because of the extended Japanese voice acting, I was later proven wrong because the tournament announcer's scenes in the championship mode where he announces the fights are still intact and it's all in Japanese. This also explains why the battles just kind of abruptly start without any kind of build-up in the American version. There's normally supposed to be something there. So I'm going to very quickly go over the modes in this game because I just could not make myself play a ton of this game. There's a player versus CPU mode where for some reason you still don't get to choose your opponent, a player versus player mode, a tournament mode that for some reason requires a second player and hilariously asks you if a second controller is connected, only to kick you back to the main menu if you say no. And finally, the build-up modes. Build-up is a mode where you select a character and level them up by fighting a bunch of opponents. Leveling up seems to increase your strength and HP, which starts pretty low. You can then save each character's progress to the memory card. Build-up battle allows you to use your built-up characters in a player versus player match using characters from multiple memory cards if you want. And that's Ultimate Battle 22. I'm kinda bummed out that this video is starting off on such a low note, but wow, this game just was not fun at all for me. I actually feel a little bit vindicated because I decided to look up reviews right before writing this part of the script, and I found one of the most beautiful reviews right up at the top. The review says, "If you're unfamiliar with Dragon Ball Z, you're excused from reading this review and should just know to avoid Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Battle 22 at all costs." Dragon Ball Z Shin Butōden was released exclusively in Japan for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn in 1995. This is technically a successor to the Super Butōden games, but I don't know if I'd go as far as to say it feels like Super Butōden outside of a couple of the design choices though. First and foremost, it's almost like this game is an apology for Ultimate Battle 22. Let me explain. The character artwork in matches is identical to Ultimate Battle 22's, and when I say that, I mean they literally brought over the artwork. The opening cinematic is also incredibly similar and features most of the same scenes. The gameplay even kind of looks similar on the surface, but let me tell you, it's like they realized what they got wrong in the last game and just did everything they could to do it completely differently, because this is actually a really decent game. Visually, this game again uses that same 2D hand-drawn artwork, but the backgrounds this time are exactly what they should have been in the previous game. They're 2D parallax backgrounds that match the art style of the rest of the artwork, and they look really great compared to the horrible 3D backgrounds we saw in the last game. Even the backgrounds that aren't super intricate or anything still look miles better than those flat 3D wastelands. Additionally, the presentation here is improved too. The pre-battle artwork is better quality, and there's fun little voice lines before the matches every time. There's also a lot of improvement in the gameplay. While the roster is the same 27 characters from the last game, they all feel substantially more responsive, and you can actually create and chain combos. This game also seems to have lifted Super Butōden's split screen system, with even the little mini characters intact. This game doesn't feel like a super in-depth fighting game or anything, but I think I'm at the point where I'll take anything as long as it's better than Ultimate Battle 22. There's one extra thing this game does that I don't fully understand though, and that's the addition of this weird new perspective plane change mechanic. Sometimes in fights, you'll see the perspective of the stage you're fighting on completely shift, and then you're on a slightly different version of the stage, I guess? I personally can't really see much of a difference though. Anyways, the modes in this game are Battle, Tenkaichi Budokai, and Mr. Satan's Tenkaichi Budokai. The modes in the battle menu are Individual Match, Free Battle, and Team Competition. Individual Match is just the 1 versus 1 mode where you fight a single battle. In this one, you have no control over the opponent character. In Free Battle, it's the same, but you can actually choose the opponent, and the battle parameters include extra stuff like stage and background music choices. Team Competition is just the tournament mode, and it works the same way as the ones we've seen before. In fact, in future games, I'm probably not going to focus too much on tournament modes unless they do something super new or unique, because I'm sure it's kind of boring just to see me describe the same thing over and over again. Tenkaichi Budokai mode is, well, honestly, I have no idea. I think it's a tournament mode. Unfortunately, I couldn't get past the character select because I think you need a second player, and I, as usual, didn't have anyone around at the time. Mr. Satan's Tenkaichi Budokai is a mode where you don't actually control any of the characters. Well, technically. Instead, you get this long, fully voiced cutscene where, something happens. Anyways, it looks like Mr. Satan's in some real trouble. The whole idea behind this mode is that you, Mr. Satan, are watching these world tournament matches happen from the background. Oh, and of course, you're betting on the outcome too. Yeah, this whole mode is a gambling mode, where you're choosing who you think the victor will be in a series of matches. Before the match, there's a few options you can take, and while I have no idea what they actually do, one of them allows you to pray, which I think is a fantastic touch. What's even more fun is that when you're in the background, you have the ability to sabotage the match in real time, using fun items like potions, banana peels, and I don't know, maybe a gun? You can choose these items before the match and they all have different effects. They can, however, also hurt the person you bet on, so you have to be super careful. Honestly, this mode is just, in my opinion, the best part of the game, and I say that having enjoyed the actual fighting part of the fighting game. It's just such a weird, wacky mode, and I think I'm a sucker for Mr. Satan content in any context anyways. Overall though, I absolutely would recommend giving this game a shot. It's not a masterpiece, but it is pretty fun to play, and it's a massive improvement over Ultimate Battle 22, especially if you try the Mr. Satan mode. If you have the means, definitely give this game a shot. Please forgive me for this pronunciation. Dragon Ball Z Idainaru Dragon Ball Densetsu, also called Dragon Ball Z The Legend, was released for the Sega Saturn in 1996. So this game is, conceptually, a huge callback to... oh man. Idainaru Son Goku Densetsu. The core gameplay loop is fighting with this tug-of-war bar and trying to damage the opponent through short battle scenes. The main difference here though is that it's far more streamlined, and there's now the capacity for up to 3 versus 3 matches. To quickly explain the gameplay to the best of my ability, you can use up to 3 characters in a team, and once you're in a battle, the controls are up to move toward an enemy, down to move away, and the face buttons to attack, shoot ki blast, charge ki, and guard. Every attack takes a little bit of ki, along with using ki to charge at opponents faster. You can also use one of the shoulder buttons to switch characters on the fly. That's pretty much it. Visually though, this game is pretty exciting looking for a spectator. The sprite work is actually really good, and the fights take place on these bare 3D arenas with 2D backgrounds in the distance. While I did hate on Ultimate Battle 22 for its simplistic 3D backgrounds, this game gets more of a pass since there's a ton of different dynamic camera angles, and the whole thing is moving at a blistering speed in comparison. Seriously though, it seems like a lot is going on here, even when at the end of the day, I'm kind of just mashing buttons. However, the biggest gripe that I have with this game is that these fights will drag. They last so long. I don't know if it's me doing something wrong, or if it's just a very drawn out gameplay system. The battle system just kind of gets dull after a while, and I found myself zoning out while I was trying to get through the story mode. On the upside, the game looks a lot more fun to watch than it is to play. While I'd normally knock it for that, this is probably the most visually busy Dragon Ball game I've played so far. It really does look like a massive fight is going on, even though it really just boils down to mashing a single attack button faster. The modes in this game are Z Campaign and Versus Battle. Z Campaign is a linear story mode covering some of the bigger fights in the series, and Versus Battle is, well, a versus battle. So I'm gonna be honest here, I didn't get super far into the story mode, and that's because this game is just, well, it's kind of boring. At least for me. Some people might really like this simplistic kind of gameplay, but I didn't really feel any kind of engagement whatsoever in it. Sure, it looks flashy, but I could have probably just watched a movie while playing this and still reliably won the battles. Would I recommend this game? Oh, maybe. If you're playing these games for the really flashy visuals and style over substance, absolutely. If you're a person who values engaging gameplay over the visual style, definitely skip over this one. Dragon Ball Z Hyper Dimension was released for the Super Famicom or Super Nintendo in Japan in 1996, with a European release in 1997. This game is normally not available in English, but I'm using a really good fan-made English patch. So visually, this is actually a bit of a departure from a lot of the games we've looked at previously. In fact, I love the visual style of this game. The character sprites are super detailed with a ton of shading, and everything is almost darker lit in a way. The sprite work is, in my opinion, probably as good as you can possibly get on this hardware, and it's honestly my favorite sprite work I've seen so far in these 2 videos. Plus, the story mode has these really nice and detailed character portraits in a really similar style that are also probably the best ones we've seen so far in any of these games. The best way I can describe it is that it's almost like whatever the inverse of cell shading is. The game's stages are also pretty nice looking. They're not anything crazy, but they look decent with a good amount of detail in the background and sometimes in the foreground too. That being said, the game doesn't really seem to have very many stages. It looks like some of them have time of day variants, and there's a bunch of different screen transition areas, but there's still not a lot of stages. I think that's actually one of the biggest drawbacks of this game to me, but it's also kind of a nitpick, I guess, depending on who you ask. Yeah, there's the stage transitions, but a lot of them are just surface to air transitions, and they aren't really that interesting to look at in my opinion. The gameplay really feels similar to the Super Butōden games in both controls and responsiveness. The main differences here are that there's now a third deflection or secondary hit move, and the flight mechanics mechanics work a little bit differently, and health and ki seem to be tied to the same bar. The flight in this game isn't something that you can enable, and instead happens through stage transitions. To be honest though, I'm kind of glad that you can't just go into the air at any time, because this game kind of suffers during the flights because the actual controls don't feel nearly as zippy and responsive in the air. Health and ki being tied to the same bar kind of confused me, but once you get used to it, it works pretty well. The modes in Hyperdimension are the story mode, the versus mode, the tournament mode, and practice mode. The story mode in this game is super linear, but I enjoy how it's presented. I might be biased since I can actually read this one's translated text for once, but it does do a nice job at condensing some of the largest moments and fights in the series into kind of a small package here. My only real gripe with the story mode is that it seems like almost every single match takes place on the same stage. The story mode also isn't extraordinarily long either. That's not really a bad thing since the game is fun enough, but it's still worth pointing out. At the end of the day, this game really does feel like the swan song of this era of Dragon Ball fighting games. Everything from here on out is on a new generation of systems, and the frequency of release of these games is actually a bit lower, believe it or not. It's not perfect, but I think they really tried their best to get a real banger out before they moved on from the Super Nintendo, and I would definitely recommend checking this game out if you haven't already. Dragon Ball GT Final Bout was released for the PlayStation in 1997. This game was technically the first Dragon Ball game to be released in North America on a home console. I say technically because while North America did get a Dragon Ball game on the NES, it was a completely reskinned game called Dragon Power with all references to Dragon Ball completely removed. Visually, this game is fully 3D, both characters and backgrounds. The characters don't look super bad, though I do think the textures leave a bit to be desired. They're mostly just flat colors. The animations aren't too bad either, and the beams in this game actually look like beams. I'm not gonna say it looks good, because there are some pretty good looking PlayStation 1 games, but I've also, unfortunately, seen much worse too, so I'm not gonna take too many points from this game. The gameplay here is, well, it's reminiscent of previous games. I'll start with that. You can punch, kick, fire ki blasts, initiate meteor combos, hold a button to dash and fly, charge your ki, and use multi-inputs to fire off special moves. When someone fires off a special move, the opponent has the tiniest little window to decide how they'll respond. They can do things like block or respond with their own move to create a beam struggle. The issue I have with this though is that when the opponent initiated a beam struggle, I had no idea how to counter that any of the times it happened. If there is a way, it's not very straightforward. Anyways, the big elephant in the room here is that these controls are incredibly unresponsive, which seems to be a running theme. And the worst part is that it's not even consistently unresponsive. When you do an input for a special move, it comes out the moment you hit the buttons. But if you want to use any standard moves or even movement, get ready for up to half a second of input delay every single time. It almost feels like it was intentionally designed this way, and it makes this game super frustrating to play. Because of this, I couldn't really ever get good at this game, and I tried really hard. Every time I got even a little bit into any of the modes, I would hit like a wall of difficulty and I would get frustrated and have to take a break. It just wasn't that fun thanks to that one little design decision, I guess. Also, I quickly want to talk about the voices in this game. The voices are, they're interesting.
You can't beat me. I can tell without fighting you. Now, should I clean the trash of the universe?
It's not bad voice acting or anything, it's just strange to hear these characters with voices that, in my opinion, don't really work. Weirdly, even though these characters have English voices in the menus and sometimes even in-game, most of the battle cries are all using sound clips of the original Japanese cast. There are three main modes in this game: Battle Mode, Tournament Mode, and Build-Up Mode. The battle modes are just Versus Computer and Man Battle. Versus Computer is basically just an arcade mode. I couldn't really get too far into the arcade mode, unfortunately, and I tried with multiple characters, but I looked it up and there is a big boss battle with Super Baby Vegeta at the end. The tournament mode is exactly what you'd expect. Build-up mode is actually the same mode we saw back in Ultimate Battle 22, but expanded a bit. This time the opponents are set up in tiers, and once you clear a tier, you unlock the next tier, and you can basically infinitely build up your character from super weak to massively overpowered. While I couldn't confirm this, I read somewhere that you could apparently also bring in your Ultimate Battle 22 save data in the Japanese version of the game for the characters that match, like Goku, Piccolo, and Cell. These build-up characters can also be used in the tournament mode too, and that's that's it for Final Bout. There's not really a whole lot to say about this game in my opinion, and I hate to say it, but I'm actually kind of thankful for that. I didn't really enjoy this game much because of how hard it was to control. I actually remember liking it more as a kid, but nowadays it just felt like a chore to play. I played every Dragon Ball Z Budokai game. Here's my thoughts. So here's where I'd normally start talking about the Budokai games. However, I actually have entire videos dedicated to just those games. So in lieu of going all the way back over all of them one by one, I'll give you a quick overview of them and then recommend that you go check out my Budokai videos after this. The Dragon Ball Z Budokai games are a series of games that were all released on the PlayStation 2 and GameCube, with a sub-series called Shin Budokai being released on the PSP. Of course, there were also some additional games that weren't called Budokai but kept the main gameplay loop and were developed by the same teams, like Burst Limit, Infinite World, and even the Dragon Ball Evolution movie tie-in game, which in essence was just a reskinned Shin Budokai game, and it was shockingly good too. These games are probably the most famous examples of straightforward fighting games in the series, and there's a good reason. These games had a ton of content crammed into them over the course of their releases, and they were just really fun to play at the end of the day. I'll stick the link to part 1 of I Played Every Budokai game in the description for this video for you to check out. But as for this video, we're moving on to what seems to be the most infamous Dragon Ball Z game ever. Dragon Ball Z Taiketsu was released for the Game Boy Advance in 2003. According to all of my viewers and the comments on the previous video, this game is the greatest game in the history of Dragon Ball video games. This game is actually, well, I don't know where to start. Actually, yes I do. This game is hideous. Like, oh my god, this game is ugly. Listen, I don't feel like I need to convince anyone here, but I'll keep a little bit of professionalism and state my reasons. The sprite work here is, for some reason, reminiscent of clay dolls that an artist smoothed out with a filter before importing it into the game, I guess? The backgrounds are passable, but also look weirdly realistic for some reason. Then you have the animation. It's less that the characters are punching and kicking, and more that they're flailing their limbs wildly, using the sheer kinetic energy of mass confusion in their bodies to hurt their opponents. What's even worse is the hilarious sky battles. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, but there's a mechanic in this game that allows you to initiate a sky battle against an enemy, and these look so ridiculous. The first time I saw it, I could not stop laughing. It looks like both characters are being electrocuted simultaneously. I'll get back to sky battles though. First, let's talk about the overall gameplay. You have a punch, a kick, a grab, and you can block by holding back. Using special button inputs lets you use special attacks, and holding L and R allows you to charge your ki. The fighting here feels okay, I guess. It's a lot of just fast punching and blocking, and the moves don't really have much weight behind them, but it works fine enough, I guess. However, you can also use a button input to initiate a sky battle. Now, back to the sky battles. Sky battles have to be initiated by both characters. One character uses it and flies up above the map. If the other character doesn't initiate it, the first character can crash back down and cause damage to the opponent if they aim properly. However, if both characters do it, the scene changes to a sky battle and a little tug-of-war gauge appears. You can push this gauge in your favor by mashing the A and B buttons, and let me tell you, you can win every single time with basically no effort. In fact, it's so easy to do, you can actually just repeatedly initiate sky battles to cheese this entire game. Well, outside of the endurance mode where sky battles are disabled, but still, I know, I could just choose not to do it, but it's also hilarious to watch, so I mean, why not? I guess I should probably mention the modes in this game. I'll only focus on a few though. The first I'll focus on is the main one-player tournament mode, which is essentially just the arcade mode. Here you fight 7 fights, and at the end, you get a small story tidbit about the character you're using, along with in-game currency or an unlockable character. The currency can be used in the Z store to unlock things like bios and images in the gallery, something this game actually has. It's not a super in-depth gallery, but it is nice to see that kind of mode nonetheless. There's also some unlockables, including this weird cheat modifier menu and even an alternate sky battle mechanic where you instead press button prompts until the fight ends. It's a shocking amount of content for a game that's so publicly despised. Speaking of, I need to say something. This game isn't good. However, this game is also kind of fun in like a really hilarious way. Does that increase the objective quality of the game? I can't really make that decision. But does it increase my personal enjoyment of the game? Absolutely. If you asked me to choose between Taiketsu and Ultimate Battle 22, I would choose Taiketsu Taiketsu without hesitation every single time. That's the thing about video games. A game doesn't necessarily have to be good to get enjoyment out of it. Sometimes the jankiness is part of the experience. That's why I would actually recommend trying this game if you have the means to. It definitely has to be experienced to be fully understood. Again, it's not good. I'm not saying it's good, but I bet if you try it, you will get some kind of enjoyment out of it. And that's a wrap for part 2. I know this part is a little short, but I wanted to break these videos up into manageable chunks, and this one just kind of worked out that way. Honestly, the highlight for me here was definitely Hyperdimension. I think this specific set of games that I played didn't really have a whole lot of standouts as far as quality goes, and it really seems like this era in gaming wasn't that kind to Dragon Ball fighting games. On top of that, the Budokai games started coming out during this time, and definitely overshadowed basically anything else that could have possibly competed, so I guess it kind of makes sense. For the next and final part, I'll be covering a handful of games up to the most recent ones like Fighters. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I know that these games aren't all iconic, but it is still nice to take a look through the history of these games and touch on some that some people may not have even known existed. Anyways, I'll see you in the next part, and I really appreciate you watching. As always, have a fantastic day.